comes from the same nerve, and the endodermal supply also comes from the same nerve. Let's look at the derivatives of the skeletal elements from the mesodermal arch. The skeletal elements and their derivatives. The first arch is called the mandibular arch, and the cartilage is called the Meckel's cartilage. Okay, first arch is called mandibular arch, and the cartilage is called Meckel's cartilage. Few things are formed from the Meckel's cartilage. The dorsal end of Meckel's cartilage forms the middle ear bones. You have malleus, incus and stapes. Malleus and incus of the middle ear bones come from dorsal end of the Meckel's cartilage. The ventral part of the Meckel's cartilage is surrounded by the mandible, and it is absorbed into it. Okay, it's absorbed into the mandible. Ventral part is absorbed into the mandible. Now this bone may be absorbed into the mandible, but the perichondrium remains, and this forms the anterior ligament of malleus and the sphenomandibular ligament. It forms the anterior ligament of the malleus and the sphenomandibular ligament. So let's now look at the derivatives of the first arch. The cartilage is called Meckel's cartilage, and dorsal end forms the malleus and incus. Ventral part forms the absorbed part of the mandible. The perichondrium remains, and this forms the anterior ligament of malleus and the sphenomandibular ligament. These are the derivatives of the first skeletal element of the first pharyngeal arch or the first branchial arch. Let's now look at the second branchial arch. Now here, from the second branchial arch, from the skeletal element, you have the formation of the facial bones. You have the formation of maxilla, mandible. Maxilla comes as part of the upper jaw and cheek. Mandible is the lower jaw. Zygomatic again forms part of the cheek. Palatine bone forms the roof of the mouth, and the temporal bone connects the face to the ear, etc. So you have maxilla, mandible, zygomatic bone, palatine bone, and a part of the temporal bone. Now, if there is a problem, the first arch gives rise to not only the cartilaginous elements which are already mentioned here, but also gives rise to the bones of the face. It gives rise to the bones of the face. The facial bones are, now if there is a maldevelopment of the first arch, you will have first arch syndrome or mandibulofacial dystosis. You'll have first arch syndrome or mandibulofacial dystosis. There is a deformity in the formation of the cheek, nose, temporal region, etc., and the mandible, which is the lower jaw. The ears may be set very low. Okay, this is called the mandibulofacial dystosis or first arch syndrome because of maldevelopment of the first pharyngeal arch elements. The skeletal elements of the second arch produces all S bones. Okay, all the bones which are formed from the second arch start with the letter S. Stapes, which is the last bone of the middle ear. Malleus and incus is formed from first arch. Stapes is formed from the second arch. Stapes, styloid process, stylohyoid ligament, smaller or lesser cornu of the hyoid bone, superior part of body of hyoid bone. Okay, stapes, styloid process, stylohyoid ligament, lesser cornu or smaller cornu of hyoid bone, superior part of the body of the hyoid. All S bones starts off or arise from the second arch. Third arch gives rise to greater cornu of the hyoid bone, lower part of body of the hyoid bone. So if you look here, the hyoid bone, second arch is also called hyoid arch. Okay, second, the hyoid bone as such is formed from second and third arches. The hyoid bone has a lesser and a greater cornu. Smaller or lesser cornu arises from second arch. Greater cornu arises from third arch. The body of the hyoid, superior part comes from second arch, lower part comes from the third arch. So that's the formation of the hyoid bone. It's a very important bone because a lot of neck muscles are attached around the hyoid bone. The cartilages of the larynx are thought to arise from the fourth and the sixth skeletal element, the skeletal elements of the fourth and sixth arches. Okay, but there is some controversy. Some people say the fifth pharyngeal arch also contributes to the formation of the cartilages of the larynx. Let's now look at the derivatives of the skeletal elements from each of these mesodermal thickenings. The cartilage of the first arch is called Meckel's cartilage. The cartilage of the first arch is called Meckel's cartilage. The dorsal end of the Meckel's arch, that is this part, gives rise to the incus. The incus and the malleus, both are represented in red. Both of them are formed from the first branchial arch. The malleus though is formed from the second branchial arch. Okay, so from the dorsal end of the Meckel's cartilage you have the incus and the malleus which develop. All three of them are called ossicles, or they are middle ear bones. The ventral end of the Meckel's cartilage gets absorbed into the mandible. But the perichondrium of this area remains, and this forms sphenomandibular ligament and the anterior ligament of the malleus. Okay, so those are the derivatives of the first part of the cartilaginous arch. This is the cartilage of the first arch, and these are the structures derived from that. The cartilage of the second arch gives rise to the other structures which all start with a S. Okay, cartilage of the second arch give rise to structures all beginning with a S. Stapes, which begins with an S. Then you have the styloid process, stylohyoid ligament. This is the stylomandibular ligament. The lesser or smaller cornu of the hyoid bone, and superior part of the body of the hyoid bone. All of them are represented in black. Okay, all these S ligaments or S structures come from the cartilage of the second arch. What is represented in yellow comes from the third arch. These structures are the greater cornu of the hyoid bone, lower portion of the body of the hyoid bone. So if you look at the development of the hyoid bone itself, the superior part of the body is formed from the second arch, lower part of the body is formed from the third arch. Similarly, lesser or smaller cornu is made of from second arch, whereas greater cornu is made of by the third arch. These are the derivatives of the first, second and third arches. Now if you take a look at this picture, the cartilages of the larynx, that is laryngeal cartilages, thyroid cartilage, cricoid cartilage and other cartilages are formed from fourth to sixth arches. The skeletal elements of fourth, sometimes some people even say fifth, and the sixth arches give rise to the laryngeal cartilages. As we've already studied, each particular nerve supplies the derivatives of that particular pharyngeal arch. Now, this nerve will supply not only the striated muscle which comes from the mesoderm of the pharyngeal arch, but also the overlying ectoderm, that is the sensory supply, and the underlying endoderm. Okay, so let's now look at this particular nerve for which particular pharyngeal arch. The nerve of the first arch is the mandibular nerve. The nerve of the first arch is the mandibular nerve. This supplies muscles of mastication, that is chewing. Okay, masseter, temporalis, etc. Pterygoids. Okay, so they supply the muscles of mastication or chewing. Tensor tympani, which is in the ear, and tensor palati. Okay, these three muscles are supplied by your first arch nerve, which is the mandibular nerve. Second arch is supplied by facial nerve. The facial nerve also supplies the first arch muscles. Tensor tympani, this muscle is supplied by the chorda tympani branch of the facial nerve. Okay, so this actually has, the first arch actually has a double innervation. Okay, the facial nerve is the nerve of the second pharyngeal arch. Second pharyngeal arch. This supplies the muscles of face, all the muscles of expression of face, stapedius and the auricular muscles. Okay, now these help in hearing. Yeah, so these this nerve, the facial nerve, supplies all the muscles of face, therefore controls facial expressions, etc., stapedius and auricular muscles. Okay, then you come to the third arch. Third arch, the nerve is the glossopharyngeal nerve. It supplies only one muscle, so it's probably worthwhile to remember it. Stylopharyngeus. Stylopharyngeus. Okay, stylopharyngeus is supplied by glossopharyngeal nerve, which is the nerve of the third arch. Then you have fourth arch nerve called superior laryngeal nerve. As we already studied, the fifth arch disappears soon after its formation. Sixth arch nerve is recurrent laryngeal nerve. Superior laryngeal, recurrent laryngeal together will innervate the muscles of pharynx, muscles of larynx. Okay, you have the superior laryngeal nerve and the recurrent laryngeal nerve, which together supply muscles of pharynx, muscles of larynx. Muscles of pharynx will help in deglutition or swallowing and also articulation, production of sound, whereas the muscles of larynx will help in speech. Okay, will help in the production of sound. Okay, so these are the various nerves of the various arches, and those are the muscles that they supply. All the different muscles of the pharyngeal arches which are present in the region of the head and the neck, especially in the ear, in the nasal cavity or at the roof of the mouth. Okay, all these muscles are actually formed from paraxial mesoderm. They formed from the paraxial mesoderm. Paraxial mesoderm forms about 7 somatomeres or somites plus 5 preoccipital somites. Okay, so these 12 somites together, they form all the different muscles of the ear and the neck cavity. Okay, so there is a table in that we'll sing which gives you which somite gives rise to which muscle. Maybe it's worthwhile to learn up that table. Okay, so you have 7 plus 5 preoccipital somites giving rise to all your muscles. Okay, and they're all derived from paraxial mesoderm. Now let's look at the fate of the ectodermal clefts. After this, the neck is formed. On the outside you will see grooves, a series of grooves on the outside of the neck, and these are called the ectodermal clefts. Okay, they are lined by ectoderm. The dorsal part, that is between the first and the second arch, between the first arch and the second arch you have a cleft. Okay, in that cleft the dorsal part forms the epithelial lining of the external acoustic meatus. External acoustic meatus or the auditory canal, that is the outside part of your ear. Okay, the outside part of your ear, the canal leading from the out of the ear. So dorsal part of the first ectodermal cleft between the first and second pharyngeal arches gives rise to epithelial lining of the external acoustic meatus or the auditory canal. Now the pinna or the outside part of the ear or the external ear, which is called